No, Richard, hi.
Peter.
I was thinking a bit about a question which relates to how I learn and reflect on myself and the world, and how that helps me take away what isn't useful and develop what is useful for me. And that's really in relation to how much one can grow in the spiritual knowledge of yourself and your presence in the world through your own individual thought, through meditation, through self-questioning and self-reflection, and how much it's important to have a dialogue and interactions with other people where you get a reflection of your energies and your thoughts, and you see how they're turned around and come at you in other ways, and how those can be perhaps more useful to you or equally useful to you, and how you can use those two sets of experiencing elements in the spiritual path.
So can you form the question?
So for me, I'm wondering how much I can develop through my own personal thought and self-reflection, examining and seeing the world but reflecting on it myself, and how much I need to be interacting with others to share things and see the reflection of that back, which will perhaps give me a different angle on what my essence is.
Yeah,
and
fabulous.
how important those two things are.
Yeah, a fabulous question. So, it's a matter of capacity. Intuitively or rationally, or depending on how well you know yourself. The difficulty with this knowing yourself business, and I'm not, by the way, at the moment speaking of the self, what you may call, I heard you earlier, called the higher self, for example. It's not a term I use, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about yourself in your humanness. In order to gauge your capacity, and your capacity in life is linked to potential and further destiny. Now, if you look inside and you can start to get a sense of your capacity, it will be contained in visions, in dreams, of course, in imagination. It will be hidden in that place where you may have received in early life those kinds of messages that you're getting above yourself, or the ways in which you've been restricted in some way. It will be hidden in behind conforming to those kinds of statements. If you can somehow snuck round those or free yourself from from those kinds of dictates, and look deeply into your soul, you say, well, what is my capacity? And I suggest, I'm going to start at the high end of the scale here. If your capacity is for spiritual awakening in this life, and bear in mind, we haven't talked so very much together, but bear in mind, I don't consider that to be a possibility for people en masse. I'm talking about a very serious consideration of the practice of sacred spiritual life, daily and in a spiritual discipline. So, something that isn't everybody's propensity, and neither need it be. This is how things are. We're all different. So, but if your capacity is for that, then without doubt, I suggest you must have a spiritual teacher. It's not enough to think your own thoughts and to conduct your own inner inquiry, for the simple reason you're far too tricky. Everybody is. We have been now for about 100 years. We've refined this sophistication in the modern world to a degree that even counselling, even basic counselling, is becoming more and more complex in terms of the conditions that it has to face, and therefore the skills of the therapists themselves. even amateur counselling, so to speak, even part-time, even relatively shallow, superficial, counselling. Certainly in psychotherapy, when we go deeply into the psyche, it's now more complex in its structures than ever before. So
is that because we're hiding ourselves from ourselves a lot?
It's because we've become more self-conscious, really. I suggest. I think consider this idea that if you see a photograph of somebody in the 19th century, see a photograph of somebody, look at a selfie and then look at an old sepia tint, old photo in a studio from the 19th century.
Yeah.
What's going on there? What is the apprehension of our individuality 150 years ago, as opposed to this last decade or so, when even then it's changed since, say, the 90s, even now, and it's changing all the time. And what is it that we see, and what is it that what is it that young people are growing up in amongst in terms of their image of themselves in relationship to the world at large, you see.
Yep.
So the complexities, I suggest, and this is a discussion of course, but the complexities of the psyche are now more sophisticated, more complex than ever before. And even if that were not the case 50 years ago, nonetheless I'd say it was still the case that if you have a spiritual capacity, if you have the possibility for leading spiritual life, then a teacher is absolutely necessary. Now, I, like everybody, have gone in and out of this. We have Krishnamurti to consider. Truth is a pathless land. He himself, of course, was the world teacher, and he renounced the position. He gave up that job and then pronounced that everybody had to give up that kind of relationship. It was rather curious, I think. The truth is, we do need somebody who is not necessarily the world teacher, but and I liken it, I've said this many times before, I mess around on the piano and I enjoy playing the piano, but I don't have any formal training. And if I did, I'd probably enjoy it a great deal. I'd certainly be a lot better at it. It's. I mean, you can do pretty well being self-taught and so on if you have a natural propensity for some kind of creativity. But have a teacher who can show you the scales, the basics. In painting, perhaps the same thing: how to mix and how to make texture and understand form and colour and all this kind of thing. Or try and find it out on your own. I mean, which would be the better way? Certainly, in terms of the spiritual journey, it's a impossibility for almost everybody. Now, people will cite those beings, those rare beings who were spontaneously awakened into apparent full enlightenment without even any formal spiritual training at all. But of course, these are very, very tiny. For most of us, it's a case of getting through the realms, the complex realms of the psyche, to some kind of human freedom where we can embrace spiritual practice in any kind of consistency and application, and staying with it, and courage, humility, all of these kinds of things. We need a teacher. We also need a sangha, by the way, which is the other thing that you're saying. When you have insights in yourself from your own deliberations and your own inner inquiry, which is surely the heart of it, but then you can test it out with others. Absolutely necessary. Very, very important. The corollary of that has been said many times before, is you move towards those kinds of people, and I'm afraid you move away from these other kinds of people. They are the people who are not supportive of your inner inquiry, may ridicule you, may pull you back in some ways from the fruits of your own insights. And although it may seem divisive, there is nonetheless a time when that's very necessary. that you are spending time in the right kind of milieus, the right kind of environment, in the right society, shall we say. It's been said many times over hundreds and hundreds of years by spiritual teachers, avoid bad company, or and so on. That's because it's like the plant coming up through the earth. It needs just the right conditions, and then it will become the flower. So, capacity, the need for the spiritual teacher of spirituality is a real goal or a real aspect of one's potential. You can't do it on your own.
And is there any advice about how much some of us have had fairly simple lives which have flowed smoothly without too much sort of major ructions and problems along the way, and other people have had quite deep crises, sometimes coming from inside themselves in a sense through their emotional state, but sometimes from outside forces and actions on them, which can give much greater depth of learning experience in a sense, but can also leave one sort of needing some healing time also to go through that. Is there something about pushing yourself out and forward and into more risky areas and zones which helps one process and take things on?
Well, I think it's true that at this time in human evolution, the people who are drawn to inner work, therapy, even spiritual path and so on, are people who have suffered in some explicit way, or there's been difficulties for them. They haven't had an easy time of it, so to speak, in one form or another. And just looking back at the many years of working with people individually in workshops and trainings that I've had, generally speaking, when you explore with the people who come to you, in my case, there's trauma. There's trauma somewhere or other, and it may be buried, and it may be hidden, it may be denied, but it's there. And so I think we tend to come to the conclusion that if you've had the easy life, and you can say, I loved my parents, they loved me, everything went fine, we had enough money, I had all the attention I needed, that probably there isn't that motivation to stick with inner work, because there's not the material, really. Nisargadatta said suffering is a way of love drawing attention to itself, which is rather a lovely way of saying it. And therefore, I think we can say that suffering, or our trauma that is revealed to us, even we revisit through inner work, becomes the very way in which we become aware of truth, we become aware of love. And so in that sense, the person who's had an easy time of it isn't really having such an easy time. Do you see what I mean? In order to, if you've had an easy time of it and you aspire towards higher levels of consciousness, for want of a better way of putting it, then maybe you do have to put yourself in the way of risk in a sense. Maybe you have to try literally throw yourself in. Maybe even more reason to seek out a teacher earlier who will, after all, find the profound challenge in the ordinary, for you. Just a brief anecdote, because it's something close to my heart. Gurdjieff, spiritual teacher, 100 years back and less, of course, Armenian spiritual teacher who soaked up much of the Middle Eastern traditions that were dying out, as indeed were the national boundaries, and the world was changing during that time, had a doctrine of his teachings. It was called the chief fault, and it's only slimly explained what this chief fault is, but we do have a very interesting account of him working with the chief fault in a group assembled in Moscow. in for, let's say, 1920 or something like that, somewhere around the Bolshevik Revolution, a bit earlier probably. So he's there with these fellows in Moscow, and he used to announce these spiritual meetings of his, about 2 hours before they were going to happen. And you had to show your dedication by turning up. So he's got these fellows there. And according to Ouspensky, who wrote the book The Fourth Way, in which this anecdote is related, he looks around the room and he tells everybody something very simple that they should do in order to become aware of themselves. And it was inevitably the very thing they didn't want to do, the very thing that they denied that they were doing the opposite, if you follow me, and the thing they had the most resistance to. So to give you an example, he would say to the quiet fellow who never talked in the meeting, you must talk a lot. And if you said to this fellow, you never talk, he would deny it, which is a kind of proof of the chief fault. And to the fellow who's always talking, say, you must be quiet. And as ordinary as these things sound, the idea is they are right at the nub of the cycle of the character of the person. And if the character is defensive, if the character is essentially a way of me saying, I am separate from you, I'm avoiding meeting, relationship or intimacy with you or with the world or any of its events. And if you're able to pick the very centre, then in a sense, perhaps even for the person who's had an easy life, there is the greatest challenge of all. So I think if I was with somebody who was saying, I've had it easy and I wish I could take more risk, and so I'd say, find a teacher. One of my definitions of the teacher is that one who knows you better than you know yourself. And you intuitively have that feeling. I was blessed with that, and it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying because you're naked. And you're also very confident. You're very confident that you're going to get somewhere because of this. And you aspire to that consciousness, that awareness of self. Only the person who knows you better than you know yourself could put their finger on that nub, and then you may take a very long time to work through that, to rectify it, hence the chief fault.